an honor to be here in the PA Wilds and be part of this great event. I'm always a little humbled and embarrassed by these kind of introductions that Meredith just gave. And I realized how perilous the introductions could be the first time my wife showed up at one of my talks. And so I was, of course, interested in what my wife thought about what I had to say. So I went up to her afterwards and said, well, what'd you think, honey? She said, well, that was fine, but the introduction was ridiculous. And I said, oh, what was the matter? She said, well, the only thing they didn't say about you is they didn't say you were a model husband, now did they? And I said, no, but that's a great idea. Maybe I'll add that to my bio. She says, go home and look up the definition of model in the dictionary. And if you look it up, it means a small replica of the real thing. So, as I said, it is great to be in this very special place. And I do believe that this is a place of great people, great history, great resources, great traditions. And I want to say, just having observed this process since the beginning, that this is one of the single greatest rural, natural resource-based economic development programs in the United States of America, and you should be very proud of that and what you have accomplished here in this region. It's not a surprise to me that people in Lithuania have posters about the PA Wilds, because people in the world that I live in and work in talk about this initiative all over the country, because it's about taking what's special and making it valuable. But my talk tonight is really about the fact that there is no place in the world today that will stay special by accident. Why is that? Well, it's because the world, ladies and gentlemen, is changing faster than ever. What's changing? Well, the economy is changing, demographics are changing, technology is changing, consumer attitudes and market trends are changing, healthcare is changing, the weather is changing. Now, I understand that people, particularly in small towns and rural areas, they don't like change. But the truth is, in America today and in the world today, there are really only two kinds of change. There is planned change and there is unplanned change. I mean, you can anticipate the changes that are coming, you can prepare for them, you can shape and direct them in a way that you like, or you can just let them happen. You can grow by choice or you can grow by chance. You can shape the future you want, or you can accept the future that you're given. You know, Abraham Lincoln used to say that the best way to predict the future was to create it yourself. And I think that's what the PA Wilds initiative is really all about. It's about shaping a future that you want and that grows out of what you already have. Growth is really about choices. I mean, should we be investing more in our downtowns or investing more out on the highway? And I really don't think that happy face makes the one on the right better. You know, should we be, building upon our existing assets, or should we be ignoring our assets? Should we let the character of our community shape the new development, or do we just don't want to allow the new development to shape the character of our communities? Growth and the PA Wilds initiatives are about this. That's my son. He's 38 years old now. But it really is what this is about. It's about your children. It's about your grandchildren. It's about the future, and it's about preparing for the future, and it's also about balance and harmony. It's about that relationship between conservation and economic development, jobs and the environment, the built environment and the natural environment. And perhaps most important and fundamental of all, it's about that relationship between people and the land. People and the land. It's also about finding the win-win solutions to the problems that face us in America today. I'm one of those people who think we spend way too much time in this country fighting about what we disagree about. And not nearly enough time sitting down community by community to talk about what we do agree about. And I tell you, when you do that, you find that you can reach consensus about place. Because most Americans care more about the place they live than the political party they belong to. And when you talk about what really matters about the place you live, you can actually reach consensus, and that's part of the success of this effort. So you say, well, what does win-win look like actually on the ground? Well, let me show you a few examples some things that might be good for business, good for the environment, and good for the community. Let me just show you a couple of slides, ask you a few questions about them. So, show you two streets. First question is, which street would you rather live on? Next question is, which street do the houses cost less money on? Last question, which street is better for the environment? Oh, and by a fourth question, which street is safer for children? So here's the first street. Here's the second street. What's the difference between these two streets? Well, it's 16 feet of pavement in the width of the street. So what happens if you add 16 feet of asphalt to the width of a street in a residential subdivision? Well, the first thing that happens, you just drove up the cost of every house along that street by $4,000 to $7,000 a house. Because the streets are the most expensive part of the development process. So more asphalt means less affordable housing. It means more soil erosion, more sedimentation, more non-point source pollution running off into our rivers and streams. And oh, by the way, when the wider the streets are, the faster the cars go. So when you actually have a little bit of a narrower street, the cars slow down. The children are safer. Good for business, good for the environment, good for the community. So let me show you another example. Let me ask you a couple questions about these pictures. So, would you rather live on this street or this street? I want to tell you something. The houses are identical on those two streets. Which one has higher property values? Which one has lower utility bills? So let me just tell you what the National Association of Home Builders says about this. They say, that trees add incredible value to property. And by the way, did you know that the temperature on a hot summer day here can be 9 to 10 degrees higher than in the same city than the temperature here? So, as it turns out, dollars do grow on trees. So let me ask you about landscaping. So some years ago, I was called in to talk to a group in a place called Baldwin County, Alabama. That's the southernmost county in the state of Alabama. It's on the eastern shore of the Mobile Bay, and it's kind of the epitome of what you'd imagine the Deep South to look like. Huge live oak trees with Spanish moss coming down. And there was a proposal there, the first one in the history of the state of Alabama, to preserve large trees in the parking lots of shopping centers. Now, you might have thought that somebody had proposed the end to Western civilization as we know it by proposing to save these large trees. And there were people saying, well, nobody will go to the shopping center anymore if there's trees in front of it. Like, what? You would just forget where the shopping center was? What was that all about? So anyway, they said to me, well, why don't you just, what do you think we should do? I said, well, why don't you just ask people what they think? Now, do you have any idea how hot it gets in South Alabama in the summer? So they hired a polling group that works out of the University of South Alabama, and they asked them a whole bunch of questions, including this question that I just asked you. They said, would you prefer to shop in a shopping center heavily landscaped with trees and bushes, or would you prefer to shop in one without any? And what do you think people said? By a margin of 92% to 4, with 4% undecided, people said they preferred trees to asphalt. And they did pass that tree ordinance, the first one in the history of the state of Alabama. But what's interesting about that is that we oftentimes say the same thing places all over the country. Trees are very good for business. We do research at the Urban Land Institute where I live. Now, we're an education and research organization, and we did a study of landscape projects in all kinds of settings, shopping centers, multifamily housing, neighborhoods, etc. We found that trees and landscaping increase the rate of, increase the value of properties in about 8 different ways. I've just listed 4 of them here. Increase the rate of financial return. This is in your shopping center from 5 to 15%. Increase the rate of project absorption, means you lease your stores out faster. Increases employee productivity, morale, and job satisfaction. Helps developers win support for proposed projects, especially in contentious situations. You want to get everybody upset? Cut down all the trees. Now, and I know people say to me, well, it just costs less money to save those trees, and we plant some new ones at the end, but there's a big difference, ladies and gentlemen, between cost and value. It might cost you a little more to save those trees in the beginning, but it'll create much more value at the end of the day in terms of your rent, etc. And by the way, did you know there's even research now that shows that people who are recovering from surgery will recover faster if they look out the window of a hospital and see greenery as opposed to asphalt? Trees, good for business, good for the environment, good for the community. Let's talk about economic development, because economic development is also about choices. Should we be spending most of our time and money trying to recruit new industry, new businesses, or should we be thinking more about the businesses that we already have and the assets we already have and how to build on those assets? I want to tell you how the economic development model has changed. When I was growing up, it was all about cheap land and cheap gas and low-cost labor. I want to tell you, it just simply doesn't work in the world we live in today. It's not about shotgun recruitment today. It's about laser recruitment. It's not about low-cost positioning. It's about high-value positioning. It's not about cheap labor. It's about highly trained talent. It's not about what you don't have. It's about what you do have. And by the way, quality of life is critically important in a world where capital is footloose. When I was growing up in the state of Alabama, our rural economic development program was, let's just widen all the highways. And then we lined the highways with a bunch of junk, and we called that economic development. But I want to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the most important infrastructure investment in America today is not roads. It is education. Education. You know, it's interesting watching that video of the manufacturing industry. Fantastic video by the young people in the back of the room. Way to go, kids. Great job. But our problem is, in many places, we have more of those kind of jobs than we have people to fill those jobs. And so we haven't been training for the kind of modern industrial economy that we have. And I want to suggest to you also that the one big thing in economic development rarely works. So I remember when American cities had an arms race to build the biggest convention center. You know, and most cities will never win that arms race. And then it was a festival marketplaces, which worked fine in Baltimore and in Boston. But did you know there were 19 other cities that built festival marketplaces that went bankrupt within 3 years? Like downtown Toledo or Norfolk or Jacksonville. And then it was aquariums. Everybody had to have an aquarium. Even the city of Camden, New Jersey, that said if we could just spend $80 million building an aquarium featuring the fish of New Jersey, that we could save Camden. Well, they did build that aquarium, and it is a very nice aquarium. But did it save Camden, New Jersey? No, it did not. Because successful economic development is rarely about the one big thing. Much more frequently, it's about lots of small things working synergistically together off of a plan that makes sense for you and your community. And I believe that's what the PA Wilds plan is all about. It's about identifying your assets and building on those assets. You know, and I want to suggest to you, and I can spend a lot of time talking about economic development, which is mostly what I do in these days. But, you know, I think there's a couple of keys to economic development today. One is talent, smart people. How do you attract and retain smart people? Innovation. How do you know, create like places where people and ideas can come together? Connectivity. You know, our downtowns are where jobs are going oftentimes today because that is the place where people and ideas can come together. But the last thing is distinctiveness. If you can't differentiate your community in the world we live in today, you will simply have no competitive advantage. You know, there's a new publication, this is put out by the World Bank, called The Economics of Uniqueness. And for probably 300 pages, they talk about all the ways that sameness is a minus in the world we live in today. It is not a plus. So let's think about that. So, you know, this is a quote from Joe Courtwright, who runs a group called CEOs for Cities. He says, unique characteristics of a place may be the only truly defensible source of competitive advantage for cities and towns. So it is your public lands, it is your scenery, it is your beautiful small town that set you apart. And the more you lose of those distinctive assets, the less competitive you'd be. So that's why I believe this initiative has been so successful and so popular. Let's talk about community character. You know, Mark Twain used to say we take stock of a city like we take stock of a man. The clothes or appearance are the externals by which we judge. Let's talk about a community's front door, its gateway, And just like with meeting a person, a good first impression is important, and a bad first impression is hard to change. Do you think you'd rather visit the town of Franklin, Tennessee, or would you rather go to the town of Midfield, Alabama? Which one looks more like a community with a sense of pride and a sense of place? Which one looks more like a community that you would rather invest time or money in? If you don't remember anything else I say tonight, remember this. The image of a community or a region is fundamentally important to its economic well-being. And what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is that every single day in America, people make decisions about where to live, where to invest, where to vacation, where to retire, based on what our communities look like, what they look like. So looks do count. Community character does matter. Let's talk about tourism for a second. Tourism is kind of important because it is the biggest industry in the world. It is the first, second, or third largest industry in every single American state. So this is the official travel guide for the state of Oregon. Check out their slogan. It says, "Oregon, things look different here." Can you imagine a state travel brochure that said something like, "Pennsylvania, things look the same here"? Well, of course not. Because what is tourism? It's about visiting places that are different, unusual, and unique. The more any town in Pennsylvania comes to look just like every place else, the less reason there is to go there. On the other hand, the more a community does to enhance its uniqueness, whether it's architectural or historical or cultural or artistic or whatever, the more reason there is to go there. If every place was just exactly like every place else, there'd simply be no reason to travel any place. The image of a community is fundamentally important to your economic well-being. So the realtors like to put it this way. They say the place is becoming more important than the product. And what do the realtors mean when they say this? What they mean is what is going on outside of a house is more important than what's going on inside of a house. Or let's put it a different way. The character of a neighborhood is more important than the size of the lot. So think about that. It's interesting, if you come down to the D.C. area where I live, so the two most highly valued neighborhoods in the entire metropolitan area are Georgetown and Old Town Alexandria. And all the houses cost at least $1.5 million. Most of them are 200 years old. Why would anybody pay $1.5 million for a 200-year-old house? Is that because they like to do home repair? No. Because people will pay a lot of money for walkability and charm. Something we haven't been building a lot of in America. And so there's a supply-demand imbalance between the kind of neighborhoods that people want to live in and the kind of neighborhoods we've been building. And so in every single major market in America, we have an oversupply of large lot single-family housing and an undersupply of everything else. Small lot housing, cottages, bungalows, multifamily housing, in-town housing. By the way, did you know that the fastest growing form of household in America is a single person living alone? And that 75% of all American households have no school-aged children? People like me, empty nesters, unrelated singles living together. Turns out a lot of those people do like the idea of living in a town. Like maybe upstairs above a store. Actually, we had that concept in America for like 300 years. And that was our model for development. We called it a town. The mayor of Oklahoma City, who's also the head of the Republican Mayors Association, he likes to say that economic development is really the result of creating places that people want to be. There's nothing that people like more in America than like looking at other people. A classic example of that is right here in the state of Pennsylvania. Did you know that in 1995, sidewalk cafes were illegal in the city of Philadelphia? And did you know that exactly 10 years later, they had 4,400 outdoor cafe tables? And that Center City was the fastest growing zip code in the state of Pennsylvania? It's kind of like the sociologists who say there's nothing people like better than looking at other people, just like hanging out, etc., etc. So I want to suggest to you there are a few things you might want to think about when you're thinking about preserving distinctiveness and uniqueness. Let's start off with downtown. Downtown is kind of important because downtown's the heart and soul of any community. You know, if you don't have a healthy downtown, you simply don't have a healthy town. You know, the apple rots from the inside out. If we haven't learned anything else in the last 25 years in the world of community development, is it's kind of hard to be a suburb of nothing. And the truth is that people will look at your downtown if they're thinking about a relocation decision. That's the first thing they'll look at. It didn't even matter. It doesn't care if they're going to be located downtown. So for example, look at the headline of that magazine. That's a magazine for industrial park developers. When site searching the South, make sure you inspect the communities downtown first. Because it says so much about a community. It's like the icon upon which people judge. And it is that place where people and ideas can relate to each other. And it's a key asset in regional prosperity. Let's talk about historic buildings and neighborhoods and landscapes. Something you have an abundance of, and that Pennsylvania has an abundance of, although we've been losing a lot of them in recent years. You know, some of you probably read some of Thomas Wolfe's famous novels. You know, he's the guy that wrote Look Homeward, Angel. He penned the immortal line, "You can't go home again." Well, sadly, Tom Wolfe, he can't go home again to at least to his original house, because here it is in this parking lot in Asheville, North Carolina. Why are historic buildings important? Well, I would suggest first and foremost because these are the places that physically connect us to the past. These are the places that tell us who we are and where we came from. As Daniel Webster once wrote, he said, quote, "The man who feels no sentiment or veneration for the memory of his forefathers is himself unworthy of kindred regard and remembrance." At its essence, saving the historic buildings of Pennsylvania is about saving the heart and soul of Pennsylvania. You know, a town without a past is like a man without a memory. So that's another key asset that's worth thinking about. And on Monday, I will be in Pittsburgh for the National Main Street Center Conference, and we'll be providing some new figures on Main Street, which has leveraged about $71 billion since 1980, and pound for pound, dollar for dollar, one of the most successful economic development programs ever created in the United States. And for every dollar invested in a small town restoration of a business, $39 in private money has been leveraged by that. Let me just show you one example. So this is one of the first Main Street communities in America. It's called Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin. That was their fire station. And like so many small towns, this was a town going downhill. Then they brought in the Main Street program, and among the 4 principles of Main Street is working with the owners of buildings to restore the facades of their building. And they did that beautifully, and it tells a story about the history of the building, but guess what else happened? Well, sales of pizza almost doubled. And it sustained that over a multi-year period. You know, preservation, very good for business. Let's think about it from the standpoint of the PA Wild's tourism initiative. Tom, you know, Arthur Frommer, who's the most well-known tourism expert in the world, basically says among cities and towns with no particular recreational appeal, those that preserve their past continue to enjoy tourism. Those that haven't receive almost no tourism at all. Tourists simply won't go to a city or town that's lost its soul. So saving the soul of your community is actually kind of important. Let's talk about parks and green space and natural areas. Parks are incredibly important, and play a key role in community revitalization in both big cities and in small towns. Some of you have probably been to Millennium Park in Chicago. You see the picture on the right there with the fountain that makes faces with different pictures of people in the city. But did you know that park, which did cost a fair amount of money, has created about $3 billion in new real estate value around that park? It's the #1 tourist attraction in the entire state of Illinois. There's now thousands of units of housing development around it. And you say, well, that's not something we can do up here. Well, you could maybe do something like this. So every year I fly to a different place in the U.S. and I just ride around to small towns and I take pictures. I went to Southwest Texas a few years ago and I went to 13 small courthouse squares. They got more counties in Texas than any place else. They got great courthouses and they have these beautiful little courthouse squares. One of the towns I visited was this town, Sulphur Springs, Texas. Beautiful courthouse. But of course there's nothing going on there except one day a year, the 4th of July. They have a big celebration downtown. So what did they do? Well, they decided to put a splash pad on the lawn of the courthouse. And guess what happens? Now people come downtown every single day. Now there are 300 events a year in the courtyard. And by the way, all the little businesses around the courthouse square came back to life. Economic development's not about the one big thing. It's lots of small things working synergistically together. How about Rapid City? Took a place for cars and turned it into a place for people. And by the way, that's an ice skating rink in the winter. And this has created an incredible amount of value in their downtown. And I know some of you say, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Do you really think that's true? Let me ask you this. Do you think this scenic view has more value, or do you think that scenic view has more value? I want to suggest to you that the scenic landscapes of north central PA have quantifiable economic value. The National Association of Real Estate Appraisers did a study on this, and they say, quote, you can put a dollar value on a view. Scenic landscapes are an economic asset, not just because you and I think they're nice, but because other people are willing to pay to see the view, to experience the unique character of a place. They went on to say, quote, a mountain vista or proximity to park, water, or green space affects the value of a home more than the size of the house, the number of rooms, the type of appliances, or even the presence of a swimming pool. The surrounding environment is the single most important factor affecting the market value of homes in the United States. So looking around this landscape and trying to capitalize on that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about architecture and community design, which was the whole idea behind the community design guideline. And I think there are several questions that are worth asking. One is, should chain stores and franchises ignore the character of your region? Or should they respect the character of your region? Do you want the character of your community to shape the new development? Or do you want the new development to shape the character of your community? And how you answer those questions will depend on what kind of community you have 25 years from now. So, we live in a nation of highly varied history, climate, culture, and terrain. Yet so many of our communities look like they're being built with Legos, interchangeable parts. Ask yourself this, do you think every chain store and every franchise in America look exactly alike? Whether it's in Maine or Maryland, Missouri, Montana, or DuBois, Pennsylvania? The answer to that, ladies and gentlemen, is no, of course not. Any building can fit in with your community. There is a new McDonald's. It's in a small town in eastern Long Island called New Hyde Park, New York. It's kind of amazing because prospective brides come here to pose for their bridal photographs. Now, that's not something you'd say every day about a McDonald's in America. But I want to tell you something. This is actually going on all over the United States and all over the world. So here's another little McDonald's. It's in a little town in upstate Vermont. And it looks like a New England style building. And why is that? Because it's in New England. Don't you think that buildings in one part of the world ought to be different from buildings in another part of the world? Shouldn't a new McDonald's in, New England be different from a new McDonald's in the desert Southwest? And shouldn't a new McDonald's in the desert Southwest be different from one in the Southeast? And shouldn't a new McDonald's in the Southeast be different from one in the Midwest? And shouldn't a McDonald's in a small town in Maryland be different from one in a small town in Maine? And by the way, that's in Freeport, Maine. Freeport's where the LL Bean Company is headquartered. That's called the Gore House. That is the first McDonald's in the United States that went into an historic building, 1980. And what had happened was that McDonald's had optioned that corner, and their plan was to tear down that house and put up their typical suburban-style McDonald's. And the town of Freeport said no. And McDonald's sued Freeport, and they lost. And then they sued Freeport a second time, and they lost again. But guess what? 3 years later, a picture of this McDonald's appeared in their annual corporate report as an example of their good community stewardship. But I want to tell you something. No, they're not suing anybody for this anymore. They're actually doing this all over the world. But only in communities that are savvy enough to say, I want something that fits with my town. I don't want your off-the-shelf model. What you need to know about chain stores and franchises is that every single one, everyone has plan A, plan B, and plan C. And what gets built depends on you. You know, it's kind of like the Good Witch of the West said in The Wizard of Oz, you have the power. You've always had the power. You know, it always amazes me. So I go into these towns out west, small towns, and I say, well, how'd you like it if the federal government came into town, told you what the town was going to look like? It'd be like, get the guns, we're going to fight. But you let these multinational corporations come in and tell you what your town's going to look like? You don't have to accept that. Because every one of them, they don't even consider doing that in the Annapolis, Marylands of the world, or the Santa Fe, New Mexicos. They always know they have higher expectations. So, so let me just show you, you've heard, CVS, Rite Aid, Walgreens. So here's your off-the-shelf Walgreens. They always want the maximum corner. They want to tear down some historic building to put the Walgreens there. Well, you could have that Walgreens, or you could maybe get a little better design, or maybe you could get something like that. Okay, and by the way, all the Plan Cs are different because every place is different. So, once again, what gets built really is up to you. That's a little town in Maine. That's a brand new Rite Aid. Because they thought that design mattered. Because what a community looks like is important to your economic well-being. So, I have like hundreds of examples, but I'm just showing you a handful of. So here's your typical, Burger King. Let me show you another Burger King. There's one. That's in Chesterfield, Virginia. Somebody said to me, well, that may not be great architecture, but at least it says Virginia. Or how about, Subway? We saw a great example tonight of what Subway's done. But they're doing this lots of places. So there's a Subway in Juneau, Alaska. And here's the one we saw tonight in New Bethlehem. I love the fact they got solar up on the roof there, which is pretty cool. Or even how about a Dollar General, They don't all have to look exactly alike. In fact, they're doing different things all over the country, just like everybody else is. How about a gas station or a convenience store? So I'll tell you a little story. So I was in a little town in the Adirondacks called Old Forge, New York. And I had given this talk. And this company called On the Run showed up like 1 week later. And they went to their planning commission. And they started talking to this guy about this guy, Ed McMahon. He was in town. He was talking about Adirondack-style architecture. And the guy was like, what? And they said, well, we just want you to go drive around town and look at these 10 buildings and then come back and talk to us. And there was no laws there were no laws in Old Forge that require you to do anything. But they went around and looked at the town. And they came back. Let me show you the gas station they built in its place. Just because they asked. Nobody's going to do anything unless you ask. And if you put that together with show people, it's not enough to tell people what you don't want, show them what you do want, which is why your design guide is so important. And the earlier you sort of talk about this stuff, people, the more likely they are to do it before they've invested time or money in hiring an architect, for example. And by the way, let's say a word about local business. If you spend $1 in a locally owned business, it will circulate through your community at a rate 3 times more than if you spend $1 in a chain store. And that's because, locally owned business, their accountant is a local accountant, or a lawyer is a local lawyer, their PR firm is a local lawyer. You spend $1 in Walmart, it ends up in Bentonville, Arkansas. So supporting local business is also part of this initiative. What about arts and culture? Museums, theater, playhouses, historic houses, festivals, murals, public art, etc. One of the things that I love about this area is that you have a great story to tell. When I first started coming up here 20 years ago, people would put me in a car and drive me around and tell me the story, but the story of the place was not manifest in the landscape. And what public art can do is tell your story. Can make the story of your town, whether it's Williamsport or Ridgeway or whatever, make it come alive. And then people appreciate the place more. The stewardship level grows up. So this is a Chisholm Trail mural in Fort Worth. And now, this is why Fort Worth exists, because of the cattle drives. And by the way, that parking lot in front of that mural is now gone. It's now called Sundance Square. It's the most important square and park in downtown Fort Worth. This is where I live. This is Tacoma Park, Maryland. This is our family album. Each one of those pictures is important to the history of our town. Wiley's, for example, was the ice cream parlor that was the inspiration for the TV show Happy Days. And you've all got the same kind of things here. Or those big old postcards we used to have? Well, they have a 23-foot tall postcard in downtown Orlando that shows you what old Orlando used to look like. Who would know there was an old Orlando if you didn't have that? You know, and you can celebrate famous people. I mean, Babe Ruth, William Faulkner, Buddy Holly. And some people say, well, we don't have any famous people from our town. Well, then celebrate ordinary people. The people who made your community what it is. Whether it's a waterman or a timberman or a rancher or a coal miner or out in Seattle, it's the commuters. That's in a neighborhood called Fremont. That's a sculpture called Waiting for the Interurban. There used to be a streetcar line running down that street. These folks are waiting for the streetcar. I mean, it's not coming, and they don't seem to mind. But it's become a placemaker. It tells people where they are. And in a world of anonymity, that's kind of an important thing. You can also celebrate famous events. That's probably the single most popular sculpture in Washington, D.C., at the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial. You go there any time and you will see tourists standing in the bread line having their picture taken. But it really tells the story of the Great Depression or the lunch counter sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina. You can even celebrate, you know, the industries and products that made your region. Did you know that every street light in Hershey, Pennsylvania is a Hershey Kiss? You know, and you know, sometimes it doesn't have to always tell a story. Sometimes it can just add fun and whimsy and interest and excitement to the streetscape. And every town in Pennsylvania got some blank walls like this. So what could you do with a blank wall like that? Well, you might do something like that. You know, they actually finally had to put a sign up because people were trying to drive into this thing. This is called a trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye mural. Just something that adds fun and interest. So I want to end by just saying a few words about, you know, I've been in the community development business for about 40 years now, and I've worked in all 50 states and probably 700 small towns. And I've come to some conclusions. Did you know that 2/3 of all American small towns are losing population today? 2/3 of all small towns. But we have a third that are growing. And they actually have a few things in common. First and foremost, successful communities today always have a vision for the future. Some people might call that a plan for the future. And I tell you, when I grew up in Alabama, there were people who would tell you, I'm against planning. Then I would always say to them, well, then you tell me the name of any successful organization, institution, corporation, or community that doesn't plan for the future. Failing to plan simply means planning to fail. As the book of Proverbs says, without vision, the people will perish. And successful visions always begin by inventorying your assets. And then successful communities build all their plans, whether it's a land use plan, an economic development plan, a tourism plan, whatever, around the enhancement of their existing assets. Successful communities use education, incentives, partnerships, and voluntary initiatives, not just regulation. Don't get me wrong, I didn't say I'm against regulation. We need some regulations. They prevent bad things from happening. They set a minimum standard of conduct, but we need to use carrots, not just sticks. And I think that the design guide, the design team, all the PA Wild people, it's all about those kind of things. Successful communities pick and choose. You know, you're going to grow, you're going to change. The question is not whether, but how. And one of the biggest impediments to better development in small towns in America is a fear of saying no to anything. Well, if you're afraid to say no to anything, you'll get the worst of everything. Communities that set no standards or low standards will just compete to the bottom. Communities that set high standards compete to the top because they know if you say no to bad development, you will always get better development in its place. Successful communities cooperate with their neighbors for mutual benefit. And isn't that what PA Wilds is also about? About a regional initiative. Successful communities consider what they look like. They have strong leaders and committed citizens. Now, sometimes the assets of the community are pretty obvious. Welcome to Jackson, Wyoming. World-class scenery. Unparalleled wildlife resources. But, you know, when I first started coming out, I didn't know you had the biggest elk herd in the eastern United States. Who knew that? People know it now, I can tell you. Or how about, you know, Annapolis? It's pretty obvious that they've got this incredible architectural, historical, maritime heritage, and they've built all their plans around the enhancement of that heritage. Sometimes the assets are not obvious. Welcome to Lowell, Massachusetts. 1975, it was a dying industrial city. It had an unemployment rate of 28%. It had never seen a single tourist, and it didn't think it had any assets. But what it had was abandoned textile mills. And they've taken all of those mills and turned them into other things. Now this is the Charleston, South Carolina of New England. This is a place that has 1 million tourists a year. This is a place that has turned itself around by thinking about what it had. You know, I love the story of the Cherry Springs State Park. You know, nothing going on until one day a guy from the International Dark Sky Association shows up. They go from that conversation to becoming the nation's #1 dark skies park. And I think that's what this initiative is about as well. It's taking lemons and turning them into lemonade. You know, and every community has assets, but we just haven't thought about them. How about this torpedo factory in Alexandria, Virginia, that's now the most successful art center in the United States? 200 working artists visited by millions of people each year. Or how about Columbus, Georgia, that realized that adversity could breed opportunity, and when they had a huge flood on the Chattahoochee River, they created one of the great river walks in America, brought their downtown back to life. Or Paducah, that turned all of their flood walls into art galleries. Or how about right in Gettysburg? Did you know that there were no utility wires running through the battlefield in 1863? By the way, they're not running through there anymore either, because of a partnership with the state of Pennsylvania, Adams County, the borough of Gettysburg, the National Park Service, the Ted Turner Foundation, etc. All the wires went underground. Or how about Lexington, Virginia, that used to have a gateway that looked like this? Here's that exact same spot today. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, you don't turn a community around overnight, but it's never too late to start. Because, you know, communities deteriorate one building and one project at a time, and that's how they get better. One building and one project at a time. In Cincinnati, they took a parking lot in the worst neighborhood in the city, turned it into one of the most popular parks in America, in a neighborhood called Over the Rhine. And in Akron, they took their old grain elevators and they turned them into the keystone of the Quaker Oats redevelopment project. Or how about in Poughkeepsie, New York, where they had an abandoned railroad bridge 274 feet above the Hudson River and have turned it into a state park that has elevators going up to the bridge. This was probably the worst town in upstate New York, now getting hundreds of thousands of visitors a year, and their downtown is coming back to life. And I understand it is not always easy getting things done in small towns in America. And I would imagine that no matter what you would propose to do, there will be some people who would tell you, can't do it, won't work, tried it already, costs too much. And I recognize that no is a powerful word in small town America. But I want to tell you a more powerful word, yes. Yes, we can make our community a better place to live in, to look at, to work in, to visit. You know, a pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. You know, if you don't care who gets the credit, you can get an awful lot done. I love this quote from Monty Python. It's about the Romans. They say, apart from sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, roads, irrigation, public health, and a freshwater system, what have the Romans ever done for us? Ladies and gentlemen, you can grow without destroying the things that people love. The PA Wilds initiative is so important because it's about revitalizing your economy, your environment, and your communities. Thank you so much for having me.